Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. As crowds continue to besiege Kabul airport, the United States is trying to find ways of getting people out of Afghanistan safely and quickly. Americans hoping to leave following the Taliban takeover a week ago have been advised not to travel to the airport unless instructed. Barbara Plett-Usher reports.
U.S. defense officials told American media they were particularly concerned about the possibility of attacks by Islamic State militants and were looking at alternative routes to get evacuees to the airport. The White House said President Biden had discussed the potential IS threat with his national security team. The Islamic State group has not publicly threatened to carry out attacks in Kabul, but recently it condemned the Taliban as U.S. stooges and said IS militants were preparing for a new phase of jihad.
One of Britain's former Prime Ministers, Tony Blair, who sent troops into Afghanistan 20 years ago, says the UK has a moral obligation to stay there until everyone who needs to leave has been brought out. In a commentary on his website, Mr Blair delivered an implicit rebuke to President Biden, saying Afghanistan had been abandoned because of an imbecilic political slogan about ending the forever wars. He said combating radical Islam was as big a strategic challenge as fighting communism. Some 450 British soldiers have lost their lives in Afghanistan. Zimbabwe's government has suggested it might give compensation to the relatives of those killed during a notorious massacre in the 1980s. About 20,000 people died in the Gukurahundi killings. Will Ross has more details.
Nearly 4 decades after the killings, President Emmerson Mnangagwa has just held talks with traditional chiefs in Matabeleland. He said they'll lead efforts to resolve the deep grievances. The government appears to be open to the idea of compensation, although that's easier said than done, given that around 20,000 people were killed by the North Korean-trained military. Critics of the president say he bears some responsibility for the massacres known as the Gukurahundi because he was security minister at the time. Mr Mnangagwa has denied any involvement in the killings.
Hurricane Grace has torn through eastern Mexico after making landfall for a second time, killing at least 8 people. The deaths and the worst damage were in Veracruz state. Will Grant reports.
At least 22 municipalities of the eastern state of Veracruz have experienced flooding, with television images in Mexico showing residents in some towns wading through dangerously deep and fast-moving floodwaters. 2 rivers have burst their banks, homes and dozens of cars were partially submerged amid the mud and water, and electricity posts and trees have been brought down. Several people have died in the state capital, Jalapa, and the civil emergency authorities have urged people to exercise extreme caution.
This is the latest world news from the BBC. Another hurricane, Henri, is making its way towards the US, prompting the authorities in New York to declare a state of emergency. It's expected to hit the country's northeastern coast later on Sunday and could be the first hurricane to reach New England in 30 years. Israel has carried out airstrikes in Gaza in response to what it calls riots instigated by the Hamas organization which runs the enclave. The raids followed a protest on the border during which Palestinian sources said Israeli troops shot and wounded more than 20 Palestinians. The army said demonstrators were throwing stones and explosives. Fawzi Barhoum, a spokesman for Hamas, said the protest was against Israel's blockade of Gaza and the tightening of its hold on occupied East Jerusalem.
We confirm the resistance here from inside of Gaza, that it's under siege. We went through battles with the Israel occupation and settled the fight and have forced new equations and rules so we could continue with our fight with full force against this Israeli occupation. It's our right to live without being under siege.
Rwanda has deported a Belgian lawyer who tried to take part in the terrorism trial of the man who inspired the Hollywood film Hotel Rwanda. Officials said the lawyer, Vincent Lequin, had broken immigration law by attempting to work while on a visitor's visa. They said he wouldn't be allowed to return. He was attempting to represent Paul Rusesabagina, a former hotelier and government critic. The Jamaican sprinter Elaine Thompson-Herah has run the second fastest ever women's 100 metres. At a race in the US, she finished in 10.54 seconds. Only one woman has recorded a quicker time, the American Florence Griffith Joyner, in 1988. Thompson-Herah won gold in both the 100 and 200 metres in Tokyo. And that's the latest. BBC News.